It is now towards the end of February, and I just finished my second reading and watching of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet. Hamlet is difficult to talk about because first you have to get over the fact that there's multiple versions of Hamlet. Hamlet is Shakespeare's longest play. However, it's made longer by the fact that a lot of modern versions put together two different versions of Hamlet into one longer version. Basically, the history of this is at some point, Quarto 1 is released, which is some background actors' version of the play. It's not like an official produced by Shakespeare. It is background character, and we can tell that because there is all of these background characters and the small role, all of these lines match with the other quartos and the folio that eventually comes out, but all the other lines are really kind of skewed. So that one's the first one that gets put out there, and then Quarto 2, which is the better version, comes out, and then the folio version comes out, and then years later eventually see that Quarto, the second Quarto, and the folio, although they are identical in terms of what the story is, in terms of the wording and the speeches and everything, they're effectively two different plays. And so they eventually get combined in a lot of modern versions to become the official version, which is, or the combined version, the longest version. It's also why this is hard, because you have to have a kind of get an understanding of where your version kind of comes from, because there are some modern versions that will rely more on the folio than the second Quarto, and there are some that rely more on the second Quarto than the folio, and there are some versions that pull from the first Quarto, the really bad one, to have an understanding of it, and then pull in Quarto 2 in the folio to fill in the other lines. So lots of weird stuff going on with just the play itself and getting to it. Hamlet, the play, really you have to think about speech acts when you're reading it and when you're viewing versions. And the reason for this is because of this idea that was kind of talked about in Much Ado About Nothing, what I talked about, which is depending on who you're around and who you're in front of, you act differently. And so we have this whole thing of character 1 and character 2 understand that each other are on stage and are in front of each other, but maybe character 3 and character 4 and character 5 are off stage, but they're listening in. So just lots of weird things like that. Really, I think what the biggest thing about this, in order to understand Hamlet, is you have to understand that they are living in a surveillance society, that everyone is doing things for multiple reasons and surveilling and trying to learn about each other. And so everything that a character says, you can never actually trust what a character is saying, because they understand that they're being surveillanced by everyone else. This is, I think, done really well in I watched, the first version I watched was an Andrew Scott version. Andrew Scott was playing Hamlet, and I think they do this idea really well of creating this kind of surveillance that exists throughout. And part of that comes from the fact that of this whole Fortinbras and Norway under theme and underlying issue that's existing throughout the entire play of Denmark doesn't know whether it's going to go to war or not with Norway. So that, like, all of those things really kind of add up to this whole idea of what is happening and what is causing the actual issues in Hamlet. The version I just watched, which is the 1948, Olivier, I think is the director of it. That's the 1948 version, movie version, gets rid of the entire Norway war possibility, gets rid of that completely, gets rid of all mention of it, which makes this it makes it a super weird thing to view, because in getting rid of this issue and getting rid of the whole Norway possibility, we are forced to really only see Hamlet as a good guy, and it's not really what this is about, right? This is entirely about that everything can be taken in multiple ways, right? So because of that reason, I'm going to be mostly focusing on my experience with the Andrew Scott version, because I feel that's much better encapsulation of kind of the themes. First question that comes up, I think, is what is Hamlet trying to do, right? And I think there are a few key scenes that really force you to think and force you to decide whether Hamlet is right or wrong. First thing is the Act 1, Scene 4 and Act 1, Scene 5. It might be just Act 5. No, it is both acts, or sorry, both scenes. You really have to decide what this ghost is and what Hamlet is doing with this ghost. Because you have your two watchmen that see the ghost in Act 1, Scene 1, and then you have Horatio that sees it in Act 1, Scene 1, right? So then you have three characters that have seen the ghost, but Horatio's only seen it once. But the other important thing to note is that when Horatio saw the ghost didn't interact with him at all. It just kind of made some motions and then left. And then you get into Act 1, Scene 5, in which Hamlet is interacting with the ghost, and the ghost speaks. But you have to make this decision about what that really means, because really your first option is to believe that yes, there is a ghost and the ghost is actually interacting. Your second option is to believe that there is something there, but it's not a ghost, but everyone else is interpreting as a ghost because they kind of see a vague outline of armor, and therefore that's the former king. And then Hamlet has his hallucination and is starting to go into madness because he's seeing the ghost of his father. Or thirdly, there's no ghost at all, and it is someone dressed in armor and is tricking Hamlet and Horatio, and the guards are in on it because the guards can absolutely lie about having seen it twice before, right? So that's your first step, is deciding which one of these routes are we going along. And I think that version goes a long way. The Andrew Scott version, I think, makes it really, really clear that the ghost is real. The Olivier version, you could interpret it as the ghost is not real because it's such a vague outline, and even though the ghost speaks, there's no physical interaction between Hamlet and the ghost. And so you're kind of left in this weird scenario of what do you actually believe or not. At the end of Act 1, Scene 5, Hamlet says, "I'll put on an antic disposition." And once again, you have to interpret this on whether Hamlet is being truthful and he is sane, but he is saying that he's going to put an antic disposition to try to trick everyone. Is he sane, but does he eventually fall into madness? And this line makes it so that Horatio and the Watchman can't say anything. Is he already mad, and this is now a cover-up for him? Like, you have to, all those versions of that line are true, and they can be shown just based on the way that you've previously shown Hamlet up to that point. All right. Another scene with this is important on whether you're having to decide whether everyone is being truthful or only some people are being truthful or everyone's lying, is the scene immediately after Polonius's death, in which our ghost reappears. At this point, you have to ask yourself, okay, is everyone being truthful? Does Hamlet see the ghost? Is the ghost real? And can Gertrude, the queen, really not see the ghost? There's your first option. Your other option, another option is Hamlet telling the truth? The ghost is real, but Gertrude, the queen, is lying, and she actually does see the ghost, but she's lying about it because she doesn't want to feed into, for whatever reason, doesn't want to feed into Hamlet's ideas. Or is Hamlet lying because the ghost is not real, and Gertrude is telling the truth because there is no ghost to be seen? And with that last one, that what you're seeing as an audience then is what Hamlet wants you to see. And at the end, arguably, you're seeing what Horatio wants you to see, because Horatio is the one that gets tasked with telling the story of Hamlet, right? So in context-wise, story-wise, the story that we are being shown is Horatio's version of the story that has been told by Hamlet. So we're already getting these layers, and therefore we have to ask yourself, well, this scene right here, who is being truthful and who's lying? Is the ghost real in this scene, or is Hamlet lying and saying this is, and effectively saying that this is madness, and therefore I cannot be accountable for what has been happening because madness has overcome me, and I'm showing that to my mother by seeing this ghost here when it's not really there? You have to figure out an answer to that question, because each interpretation is completely valid based on the way that you have played these characters up to that point and what you're trying to figure out. And then I think another important scene that you really have to kind of interpret is Act 5, Scene 2, in which the queen drinks the wine that is poisoned, that is supposed to be for Hamlet. Now, does the queen know that the wine is poisoned? There is no indication in the text that would lead you to believe that. Yet, both versions I watched have the queen knowingly and intentionally drink a poisoned drink in order to try to save Hamlet. And so the question is, well, where do you get this from? Where, and really, I don't have an answer other than it makes sense thematically, but right, there is nothing there that shows that they do know that it is poisoned. It's just another interpretation question that you have to ask yourself of, who is being truthful, who knows what, and why do they know it. I think a really profound line is spoken by Ophelia a little bit before her death. I think this is a little ways into Act 4, in which she says, "We know what we art, but not what we may be." I think that's the line. I could have misquoted a little bit there, but we know what we art, but not what we may be, which I think really frames this entire play, in which we can understand internally how we are trying to portray ourselves. We can know why we are doing things. We can understand why we have done the things that we have done. But an outside viewer can never fully understand why we're acting away. And we can never understand why they think that way. We know that we may be a certain way and that we are to act a certain way, but we will never know the interpretations or what we may be to others, because it is all in the way that we tell a story about ourselves, about what is happening. It's all up to interpretation, right? Yeah. And I think the best example of that is whether or not you think the old King Hamlet, the now dead king, is good or not. Because according to Hamlet, he's a great king, and according to Fortinbras, he's a great king, and according to Horatio, he's a great king. But we really don't get anyone else saying whether or not the poisoned King Hamlet was a good king. Because what's happening, and what has been happening, and what happens when you remove the Fortinbras Norway storyline, is this entire idea of all three of these characters, well, specifically Hamlet, Prince Hamlet, and Fortinbras, like the old King Hamlet, because he was a warlike king. He was a king that fought and conquered and tried to take other lands, and was willing to do it by his own deed, right? In telling the story, I think in Act 1, Scene 2, I think it's that scene. It could not be at that scene, though. I completely forget. But we're having a talking about what happened to the old King Hamlet, and why there's a possibility that Norway might invade Denmark. And eventually what it comes down to is that there is some sort of a one-on-one or small battle that occurs between King Hamlet and then King Fortinbras, because there's two Fortinbrases, then King Fortinbras, the King of Norway, Fortinbras, that they have a small war or even a one-on-one battle to determine whether a section of land is going to be claimed by either country. And Prince Hamlet thinks that's remarkable, and Prince Fortinbras thinks that's remarkable. But you have to ask yourself, well, is that remarkable to everyone else? Is this idea of a warlike king, and a king that is willing to sacrifice lives and force people to work day and night in order to prepare for war, is that a king that is good? Or is that a king that is good, right? And was Claudius and the courtiers and Queen Gertrude right to murder a warlike king that was never going to rest, that was never going to be satisfied, right? If that's your underlying issue that has caused all of this, who's in the right here? And should we be happy that Hamlet is going after King Claudius? Or should we be upset that Hamlet is going after Claudius because Claudius could have done the right thing? Right? And that's really at the core of this, is who's in the right, who's in the wrong, and whose story do we actually believe? If we are to believe the very end of this, which is Horatio tries to take some of the poison wine that's left over and tries to drink it, and Hamlet stops him and goes, "You must tell my story," to Fortinbras, because Fortinbras is named Denmark's heir, effectively, and just takes over Denmark. And so you have to ask yourself, well, this story that we are seeing right now of Hamlet, is this us seeing things in real time? Or is this Horatio's version of Hamlet's story? Right? Because if it is that version, we are getting a much better version of Prince Hamlet. We're getting a much better version of the old King Hamlet, and we're getting a much darker version of King Claudius. But we can never know, because we know what we aren't, but not what we may be.